The messages have stopped, you haven't reached out, and neither have they. Now you're left sitting in a silence that feels almost unbearable, wondering what it really means. Have they even noticed your absence? Are they secretly relieved that you're no longer contacting them? Or are they feeling the weight of losing you but refusing to admit it? What many people never realize about mutual no contact with an avoidant partner is that this silence isn't the conclusion of the story. It's the point where the deeper psychological process finally begins. Beneath the surface, something far more revealing is unfolding. This period of distance has the power to expose the real dynamics of your relationship, uncover the emotional patterns driving your avoidant ex, and perhaps most importantly, reveal the changes happening within you. By the end of this video on Avoidant, you'll understand the hidden emotional stages an avoidant often experiences during prolonged silence. You'll see why their emotional state can change dramatically as time passes, and you'll learn how to recognize whether they're genuinely confronting their attachment patterns or simply repeating the same cycle with someone new. Because mutual silence isn't a contest to determine who gives in first, it's a test of personal growth. The real question isn't who breaks the silence, it's who truly changes. So let's begin by looking at what's likely happening inside your avoidant partner's mind at this very moment. Chances are it's completely different from what you've been imagining. While you're probably replaying conversations, questioning your decisions, and searching for hidden meanings behind every memory, your avoidant ex is often experiencing something that catches many people off guard. They're feeling relief. When communication stops on both sides, an avoidant nervous system frequently interprets that quiet as safety. The emotional demands they believed they were carrying suddenly disappear. There's no pressure to explain themselves, no expectation to be emotionally available, no obligation to respond, reassure, or meet someone else's emotional needs. For them, the silence can initially feel like taking a deep breath after holding it for far too long. Researchers who study attachment theory describe this response through what are known as deactivating strategies. Whenever emotional closeness begins to feel overwhelming, their nervous system automatically shifts into self-protection. Intimacy starts registering as something risky rather than comforting. This isn't usually a deliberate decision. It's an automatic response rooted in the way their brain and body process emotional connection. Even when there's no genuine threat, their nervous system can react as though one exists. As a result, emotional distance becomes associated with safety, while closeness can trigger discomfort or internal alarm. That's why your silence may initially bring them a sense of calm. The emotional tension fades, their internal alarm quiets down, and for the first time in a while, they feel as though they can finally relax. But this moment is very different from every previous period of distance you've experienced together. In the past, whenever space developed between you, there was usually an unspoken expectation that you'd eventually reconnect. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they believed you would send the next message, reopen the conversation, or restore the emotional connection. You became the one maintaining the relationship. You carried the responsibility of closing the emotional gap while they remained safely distant. That arrangement gave them something very comfortable. They could enjoy the reassurance that you were still there without exposing themselves emotionally. They had security without vulnerability. They maintained a sense of control while investing very little emotional effort because somewhere inside they assumed your return was inevitable. Mutual no contact changes that entire equation. The moment you also stop reaching out, the certainty they've quietly depended on begins to disappear. The emotional safety net they never realized they were standing on slowly vanishes. For the first time, they can no longer assume that you'll always come back or continue carrying the relationship by yourself. As that realization slowly settles in, their sense of control begins to weaken. What first felt like freedom gradually becomes uncertainty. Relief slowly gives way to questions they weren't expecting to face. The silence no longer feels completely comfortable because it starts confronting them with something they've spent years avoiding. This is the point where the real psychological process begins. As the days pass and eventually turn into weeks, that early feeling of relief doesn't simply remain the same. It gradually transforms into something far more complicated, forcing them to confront emotions they never expected the silence to awaken. As more time passes, that initial sense of relief rarely stays the same. It slowly gives way to curiosity, then uncertainty, and eventually a quiet sense of anxiety. Questions begin surfacing that they never expected to ask. Why haven't you contacted them? Have you truly let go? Why aren't you trying to repair the relationship like before? And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all, what if this time they've actually lost you? The silence that once felt comforting begins to feel unfamiliar. What originally seemed like freedom slowly starts resembling abandonment. Without your consistent pursuit, they're forced to sit with emotions they've spent years avoiding. If you've experienced this kind of silence yourself, take a moment to like this video. It helps Avoidant understand what content is making a real difference, and it allows these insights to reach others who may be navigating the same painful experience. This stage often reveals itself through subtle behaviors that seem insignificant at first glance. They might quietly watch every story you post without saying a word. Maybe they suddenly react to an old picture you shared months ago. You could even receive a message that appears completely random. Hey, how have you been? I saw something that reminded me of you. I've got a quick question. On the surface, these interactions look casual, but psychologically, they usually serve a different purpose. They're not necessarily trying to rebuild the relationship. They're testing the emotional landscape. They're trying to discover whether you're still emotionally available, whether the connection remains within reach, and whether they can still access your attention without exposing themselves emotionally. Understanding this distinction is incredibly important. These small gestures often have less to do with deeply missing you and more to do with restoring the emotional balance that once made them feel secure. They want reassurance that the connection hasn't completely disappeared. They want confirmation that if they chose to return, the door would still be open. In other words, they're checking whether the emotional safety net they quietly relied upon still exists. Because once your pursuit disappears, they're left facing one of the deepest fears carried by many avoidantly attached people. The fear of becoming irrelevant, the fear of fading from someone's life, the fear that they mattered far less than they believed. While they're wrestling with those uncomfortable questions, something equally important is happening on your side of the silence. And this is where the entire outcome begins to change. In the beginning, no contact feels incredibly painful. Your mind keeps replaying memories, conversations, and every interaction, searching for clues you may have overlooked. You question whether staying silent is the right decision. Every instinct urges you to send one more message, explain yourself one more time, or fight for the relationship just a little longer. If you lean toward anxious attachment, that inner voice can become almost overwhelming. It convinces you that maintaining the connection is your responsibility, even when it's costing you your own emotional well-being. But with enough time, something remarkable begins to happen. Without constantly monitoring their moods, wondering what their silence means, or carrying the responsibility of keeping the relationship alive, you begin recovering emotional energy you didn't even realize had been drained away. Life gradually feels lighter. You breathe more freely. The silence that once felt unbearable slowly becomes a place of calm rather than fear. Instead of experiencing it as punishment, you begin recognizing it as protection. Little by little, your confidence starts returning. The self-worth that slowly faded during the relationship begins rebuilding itself. You start viewing the relationship with greater honesty, instead of through the lens of hope or longing. You notice how often you carried the emotional weight alone. You recognize how much effort you invested compared to what you consistently received. You realize how frequently you prioritized understanding their emotions while quietly abandoning your own. Eventually, the silence stops feeling like something you're merely surviving. It becomes something you're intentionally protecting. Rather than waiting for closure from another person, you begin creating it for yourself. This is the point where real emotional detachment begins. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you've finally started choosing yourself instead. This is the moment where true emotional freedom begins to take shape. Not the kind where you're pretending to move on while secretly hoping they'll notice your absence and come back, but the genuine kind where their decision no longer determines your value. You stop waiting for them to choose you because you've already made the most important choice. You've chosen yourself. That shift changes everything. As you're rebuilding your confidence, reconnecting with your identity, and discovering who you are beyond the relationship, your avoidant ex is often beginning to experience the emotional cost of the protective walls they've relied on for so long. Feelings they once kept buried start rising to the surface. Loneliness quietly settles in. Regret appears unexpectedly. Old memories become harder to ignore. They may find themselves replaying moments you shared together, wondering about conversations they once dismissed, or remembering the emotional safety your presence provided. They may even miss the connection more deeply than they're willing to admit. Yet despite those emotions, many still hesitate to reach out. Why? Because initiating contact requires acknowledging something they've spent years trying to avoid, that they need another person emotionally. For someone with strong avoidant patterns, admitting that level of dependence can feel like surrendering the very identity they've built around self-reliance and emotional independence. That's why, after enough time has passed, many avoidant individuals eventually reappear, but rarely in the way people imagine. Instead of offering heartfelt accountability or openly discussing what happened, they often return quietly. A simple text, a casual reaction, a comment that seems harmless, a small attempt to step back into your world without addressing the past. These aren't always genuine attempts to repair the relationship. More often, they're testing the environment. They're trying to discover whether you're still the same person who once pursued them, overlooked inconsistency, accepted minimal effort, and kept the relationship alive no matter how little they invested. But this time, something inside you has changed. The old emotional pull no longer has the same power. Their distance doesn't feel confusing anymore. It doesn't seem mysterious or impossible to understand. Instead, you recognize it for what it truly is, a protective pattern driven by fear of emotional closeness, disguised as independence, self-sufficiency, or the need for space. That clarity places you at the most important crossroads of your healing journey. Your decision is no longer based on hope. It's no longer built around imagining who they might become someday. It's grounded in something far more reliable: their present behavior, the actions they're choosing right now. When an avoidant person has genuinely committed to inner growth, their return usually looks very different. There's ownership instead of avoidance. They acknowledge the emotional distance that existed. They speak honestly about what they've learned during the separation. Even if they're still uncomfortable, uncertain, or afraid, they demonstrate a willingness to move toward intimacy rather than away from it. Their effort becomes visible through consistent actions instead of empty promises. But if they return with vague messages that never lead anywhere, if the conversation stays comfortably on the surface, if every opportunity for honesty is quietly avoided, then they're giving you valuable information without ever saying it directly. What they're communicating is this: I can miss what we had. I can feel nostalgic. I can think about you often, but I'm still unwilling to face the discomfort required to build a healthy relationship. And that's a reality no amount of waiting can transform. No perfectly timed message, no extended period of silence, no clever strategy, because the issue has never been about technique. It's about emotional capacity. It's about whether they're both willing and able to confront the fears, vulnerability, and discomfort that genuine intimacy always requires. Your greatest strength doesn't come from staying silent in the hope that they'll miss you. It comes from reaching a place where your silence is no longer a tactic at all. It becomes the natural expression of someone who has healed enough to stop seeking validation from the very person who once made them question their worth. At that point, your silence is no longer empty. It becomes a quiet declaration of emotional independence, self-respect, and the understanding that your value has never depended on someone else's ability to recognize it. This is exactly where an avoidant person's emotional defenses are challenged in ways that constant chasing never could. Ironically, the more someone pursues them, the easier it is for them to stay emotionally distant, because the relationship continues operating in the familiar pattern they've always known. They never have to face the possibility of truly losing the connection, because they quietly expect the other person to keep reaching out. But when that pursuit genuinely stops, something changes. The silence begins reaching places that words never could. It removes the distractions, the reassurance, and the emotional safety net they unconsciously depended on. For the first time, they are left alone with themselves. For some avoidant individuals, this becomes a turning point. They begin recognizing that the distance they created has cost them something deeply valuable. Instead of blaming circumstances or convincing themselves they were simply incompatible, they slowly start examining their own role in the relationship. They realize that constantly protecting themselves from vulnerability also protected them from experiencing genuine intimacy. That realization isn't comfortable. In fact, it can be one of the most emotionally difficult experiences they've ever faced. As they reflect, memories return with greater emotional intensity than they expected. Conversations they once dismissed suddenly carry new meaning. Moments of affection they took for granted become impossible to ignore. They begin understanding that emotional safety cannot exist without emotional openness. They start questioning lifelong beliefs that taught them needing someone is weakness, or that closeness automatically leads to losing themselves. If they commit to this process honestly, healing can begin. They gradually learn that healthy intimacy doesn't erase independence. It strengthens it by allowing two emotionally secure people to support one another without sacrificing their individual identities. But not everyone chooses that path. For many avoidant individuals, confronting those uncomfortable emotions feels overwhelming. Rather than sitting with loneliness, regret, or grief, they instinctively search for something that will distract them. They may immerse themselves in work, constantly keeping busy so they never have to sit quietly with their thoughts. They might jump into another relationship before processing the previous one, hoping that new excitement will silence old emotions. Others throw themselves into new hobbies, relocate to another city, change their routines, or fill every free moment with activity. None of these choices necessarily mean they're healed. Quite often, they're simply different ways of postponing the emotional work that still waits beneath the surface. This is one of the hardest truths to accept, because it's natural to believe that if you had loved them differently, communicated better, or waited longer, things might have changed. But another person's willingness to heal has never been something you could control. You cannot force someone to face fears they aren't ready to acknowledge. You cannot make someone value emotional intimacy before they decide it's worth pursuing. Their healing belongs to them, just as your healing belongs to you. That is why their decision is never a reflection of your worth. Whether they begin genuine inner work or continue repeating familiar patterns, the responsibility remains entirely theirs. It isn't evidence that you failed. It isn't proof that you weren't enough. It simply reflects the choices they're making about their own emotional growth. This is why silence becomes such a powerful mirror. It doesn't simply reveal what your avoidant partner is experiencing. It also reflects your own journey with remarkable honesty. During this period, you begin seeing yourself more clearly than ever before. Without constantly trying to interpret mixed signals or manage someone else's emotional distance, you finally have the opportunity to reconnect with your own needs. You begin remembering the version of yourself that existed before the relationship slowly convinced you to question your value. At the same time, your avoidant ex is confronted with something equally revealing. Without someone constantly repairing the relationship, reassuring them, or carrying the emotional weight, they're left facing their own internal world. The silence exposes both people's realities at the same time. So instead of asking the question that most people become obsessed with, will they ever reach out? Consider asking yourself something far more important. Who are you becoming during this silence? Are you using this period to strengthen your emotional boundaries instead of simply talking about them? Are you rebuilding the confidence that slowly disappeared while you focused entirely on keeping the relationship alive? Are you rediscovering interests, friendships, dreams, and parts of yourself that were neglected because so much of your energy went toward managing someone else's fear of closeness? Or are you still living emotionally suspended, waiting for one message to determine whether you're worthy of love? That question changes everything, because your future is never decided by who sends the first text. It's determined by who grows, who becomes emotionally healthier, who learns from the experience instead of remaining trapped inside it. For you, this silence can become one of the most important chapters of your life. It can become the place where your self-worth is rebuilt from the ground up. A space where you no longer define yourself by another person's ability to love you consistently. Instead, you begin creating a life rooted in emotional security, healthy boundaries, and genuine self-respect. For your avoidant partner, the silence creates a completely different crossroads. They're confronted with fears they've spent years escaping. They must decide whether to continue protecting themselves through emotional distance or finally begin the uncomfortable process of healing old attachment wounds. Silence itself isn't destructive. What it does is reveal the strength or weakness of the relationship's foundation. If a relationship can only survive because one person constantly initiates contact, repairs every conflict, carries every emotional burden, and repeatedly convinces the other person to stay engaged, then the relationship was never being sustained by mutual intimacy. It was being sustained by imbalance. And if removing your constant effort causes everything to collapse, you're not losing genuine love. You're letting go of the exhausting responsibility of trying to earn love that should never have required constant proof. So what actually happens when both of you remain silent? You discover who you are without endlessly managing another person's emotional defenses. You experience what life feels like when your energy is invested in your own growth rather than someone else's avoidance. You learn that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. You begin trusting your own instincts again. You stop confusing inconsistency with mystery. You stop mistaking emotional distance for independence. Most importantly, you realize that healthy love doesn't require endless pursuit. The greatest transformation isn't whether your avoidant partner returns. It's that by the time they do or don't, you've become someone whose happiness no longer depends on their decision. That's the real victory. Because one of the most important lessons you'll ever learn is this: You cannot love another person into healing. No amount of patience can replace their willingness to change. No amount of sacrifice can make someone emotionally available before they're ready. And no amount of chasing can convince someone to choose a relationship they're unwilling to nurture. Healthy love never asks you to abandon yourself. It never expects you to survive on occasional affection or inconsistent effort. It doesn't leave you constantly wondering whether you're asking for too much simply because you desire consistency, honesty, and emotional presence. Real love meets you with mutual effort. It creates safety through consistency. It accepts vulnerability as part of connection instead of something to fear. Even when the work feels uncomfortable, both people remain willing to grow together. If this season of silence teaches you to stop settling for anything less than that, then what feels like an ending today may actually become the beginning of the healthiest chapter of your life. And remember this above everything else: silence is never empty. When you stop fearing it, it becomes the space where healing grows, identity returns, self-respect is restored, and your future quietly begins taking shape.